Well, for the last thing that lives in a shell this month, I'm going to do a turtle. And I've started out with a rather potato looking blob for the turtle shell. There's a bright orange blob underneath that turtle, and it's basically, I've cut it out so that it covers up that orange blob. And I'm starting out by sort of basting the shell onto my cloth, but I'm working not right at the edge, and I'm using a back stitch or a stem stitch rather than a typical running stitch. And that's because the stitch is actually going to be part of the turtle shell design, but I'm using it right now to secure the shell in place so that I can then add the head and the limbs, knowing exactly where the shell is going to be. So the shell is going to be there, but I don't want my stitch line to be right at the edge, because I want it to look like the legs and the body are coming out from inside the shell. So by leaving that little bit of area around the edge, then I can start my stitches for the head and the limbs underneath the shell, and then I can stitch down the rest of this later on after I've done that part. But for now, I'm creating this line here, and that's, you kind of see that on the line of the turtle. They've got that curved part on their back, and then the last bit flares out, and it often looks like there's a line there even if there isn't actually a line. So I've used a green thread, no reason, I just felt like it. And now I've run out of that green thread, but my shell is secured on there well enough that I can go on to this next part. So I'm going to fill in the center part of the shell now, and I'm going to use an interesting stitch. Now there's somebody that I follow on Instagram called Miriam Heelan, or Miriam Textiles, who is excellent at this stitch. It's sort of, what does she call it? It's a deflected blanket stitch. So to begin with, I'm just picking somewhere approximately in the middle. I'm not really worrying about it being too exact, but if you wanted to be more precise, you could. And I'm starting my first row of stitches around in a circle here. This would be like a buttonhole wheel or blanket stitch wheel, where you do the stitch around in a circle and it comes back to the beginning to start out with the first row, and then I will show you how the deflected part works after that. But I think that in my head, I thought this was going to be a really good stitch to use to mimic the plate patterns that you see on turtle shells. And I've used this stitch before, way back in February when we were doing coral. It was one of the stitches that I introduced to create a lacy type of coral. So you could go back and have a look at that video as well. It was one of the ones that we did in February, and they're all still up there if you want to go back and look at some of the old videos. You just have to scroll through the playlist to find it. Now, once I've got all the way around in a circle, I'm going into the middle, because that, you can see that I've left, instead of stitching right into the middle, I stitched a little bit away from the middle, so there is that gap in the middle, the hole in the middle. So now I'm creating the line around the hole in that middle there, just by looping through the tails of those buttonhole stitches, the blanket stitches. Buttonhole stitches are essentially the same as blanket stitches. Is the only difference is how far apart they are. The way that I refer to them is if the stitches are really close together, like you would use if you were actually creating a hand stitched buttonhole, then it's a buttonhole stitch. If there's space between the stitches, then it's a blanket stitch, and it's used to edge blankets, so to secure the raw edge on blankets. So now that I've got the center there, and that first row, the first round of these stitches, I'm going in to start the second round. And in the second round, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the blanket stitch, but I'm going to pull slightly on the bar off the row before. I'm going to go in, and as I put my needle in, I'm going to slightly move that bar from the previous row up, so it creates more of a hexagon or sort of a straight edge shape rather than a rounded edge shape. And because this is not a circle and I want to preserve that oval shape, when I'm working on the sides, I'm making these stitches much shallower than when I'm working on the ends of them. At either end, I make them quite long so that the pattern on my shell progresses in an oval rather than as in a circle. But even so, I end up finishing up with the sides well before I get to the top and the bottom. So I'll show you how I deal with that when I get there. But in hindsight, I think that when I stitch, I find that my stitches have a certain comfortable size, and I don't want the threads to be really long, so I can only make these stitches so big. But I think that turtle shell does not have quite as dense a pattern, as much patterning as this. So if I'd made my turtle much smaller, I think that this would have done a better job of reflecting the way that a turtle actually looks. But I actually don't mind the way that the pattern looks, and because I was trying to achieve another goal, which was to cover up that big yellow area with the turtle shell, then that was what determined what size my turtle was going to be. And as I go around, I sometimes will need to make 2 stitches into each of the stitches in the previous row, but I just do whatever I need to do to make this fill in the space, and I don't worry about it being precise or exact. So I just continue around, going around and around in a circle. And here you'll see that I'm starting to get to the side. I'm getting to that green line on the side, and that's fine. I'll just go right up to the green line, and I can overlap it a bit. Doesn't matter if the brown stitches and the green stitches interact with each other. That just gives it a more of a natural look there. I've still got lots to go at the top and the bottom there, but that's perfectly all right as well. There are always ways to deal with this. And you notice those little blocks of wood in the picture here? Well, I came up with this idea. If I have stuff on my table that gave me the outside limits, that let me know where the frame of my camera was, that perhaps I would do a better job of keeping my stitching in frame. What do you think? Is it working? And I think it's kind of funny that one of them says remember, because it is a memory aid for me to keep my stitching in place there. So that looks like I'm getting close to the edge, even though that part's not stitched down. I can tell that that's a good place to stop my stitching at this end here of my turtle shell. So I'll kind of loop back to the side there to meet up with that green line. Now, I probably would not recommend doing only part of that loop. I think it would probably be a lot easier if you stitch all the way around the turtle shell instead of abandoning that part and going on to something else partway through. So now I'm going to go back in and add the stitches at this end of my turtle body, and I'll I'll just go back and forth instead of going round and around and around. When I get to the other side where it's all filled in, I'll just come back in the opposite direction till this end gets filled in. And yeah, like I was saying, I don't think it's a great idea to abandon your stitching and partway through. And you can certainly do that. Obviously, I did. Nothing's going to be terrible. I'll just go back in and finish the green line later on. But it would be easier if I had filled that whole thing in before moving on to the brown thing. But I think I was just too excited and too enthusiastic to try this out. I've been thinking about it for a long time, and I really wanted to see how it would work. So I didn't want to take the time to do more of the green shell the green line when I felt like the the cloth was already well stitched down. And here you go. There I'm going back just to fill in that last bit at the top there, and just go back in the other direction. And then I quite like the way this looks, actually. Even though I do think there are too many plates, I don't mind it. It looks very turtley to me. I don't know, is there a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle song that I could sing now? Turtles, turtles, yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh my gosh, I'm losing my mind. Do you remember that commercial with turtle chocolates? Did you have that where you lived? So that's that part of the turtle done. And I quite liked the way it looked. So now I'm going to move on to the turtle head and limbs, and I'm going to use this pearl or perle cotton. And I don't like I think I might be a sucker for punishment. So I'm going to use a stitch that I used last month when we were doing the plants, and it's a woven stitch. And previously I tried it with the six-stranded cotton, but I think that it was too easy to split the strands, so I thought I would try it again with this pearl cotton and see if that works. So for this leg, I've started my stitch underneath the turtle body, and then I've got this pin or needle there. I've looped my thread around that needle, and then I've gone back in underneath the turtle body to create kind of a V shape. And now I'm going to weave over and under those two threads there, back and forth, and you have to do this quite loosely to keep the stitches apart. So what you do is there's two and even more trouble. This is why I try not to use any pins in my work, and I wouldn't use them here except it's kind of necessary for this stitch. Although I just had a thought of how I could make this easier, but never mind that. I have to try it out and see if it works. So you don't want to pull too tightly, and all that fiddling around with the needle there has pulled my stitches quite close together. So I'm going to go in with and loosen them up a bit. And yes, this is definitely easier with the pearl cotton that doesn't end up splitting. I can use my needle here to loosen up my stitches because I don't want them to get pulled so tightly together. I want this little leg here to be quite open, to not be all squashed up. I want it to be wider. So I'm going over, under, and basically what happens is I'm whichever side I'm on off my two lines there, I go in between the two lines and under the bar closer to me. And now I'm on the other side. I go in between the two and then come back underneath the one further away. In between the two and then under. And I just keep going until I get so close to that needle that I can't do anymore. And I think that this is going to be a really cute little turtle flipper limb there. And definitely, as I said, the pearl cotton is much easier to do this with than the embroidery floss, the six-stranded embroidery floss. And I keep going and going and going. And eventually I pull out the needle because I can't do any more sewing in there without it being in the way. And now you could leave that flipper, that little leg loose there, but I've decided that I'm just going to sew it down so that it's not going to get caught on it, anything or move around. And I thought that went relatively well. And now I'm going to move over to the other side and basically do the same thing. I'm going to bring my needle up underneath the shell, the fabric for the shell. And I'm going to take my other needle or my pin. I couldn't find a pin, so I'm using another needle, and secure it into my fabric wherever I want my flipper to go. And I'm going to then create that V shape again. And I'm going to use the blunt end of my needle. It's a lot easier to go over and under without going through the fabric using the blunt end than it is with the sharp end. Or the other choice is you could use something called a tapestry needle, which has a blunt end, but then you would have to switch back when you wanted to start piercing through the cloth again. So I'm not actually going through the cloth, I'm just going through around and around those stitches, back and forth. And again, don't pull too tightly across those stitches because then it'll make the whole thing really narrow. You want to be quite loose going back and forth, but squash the stitches down towards the body, but not towards each other, if that makes sense. And go over and under, into the middle and under, into the middle and under. You come from the top and go into the middle and then under. And you'll alternate sides, one from the top, one from the bottom, one from the top, one from the bottom, but always into the middle, over the first thread, and then under the second thread. And then from the other side, into the middle, over the first thread, and under the second thread. And usually in weaving you do get a rhythm going and it starts to make sense after a while, but these are such small amounts that I don't think you really have enough space there to get a rhythm going. But if you don't find these stitches to be easy to do and you don't want to do them, then absolutely do not do them. I'm just really trying to learn some new stitches for myself, and it's a good practice for me to remember what it's like for other people, because the stitches that I'm really familiar with are super easy for me. So doing these ones that are new to me, it reminds me what it's like to be a beginner, and I think that's a good place to be. So once I've finished the stitch and gone back and forth as much as I can, just like on the other side, I'm going to take out that needle that was holding the stitches in place and then just stitch that end down. So there's nothing between the body and the end. It's just stitched down at the end. Those are some little arms for my turtle there. I think that this would actually have worked better on a smaller turtle shell. Now I'm going to work on the head. So I want the head to be bigger than the two legs. So instead of just those two spokes there, I'm going to make 4 spokes. So I looped around my needle there twice so that there are four, in weaving terms we might call those warp threads. There are 4 threads that I'm going to weave over and under. So just as I did before, all 4 of those threads start underneath the turtle shell. And now this actually might be a little bit easier to do the weaving because it's a little bit easier to see the over under pattern when there's 4. So I'm going under the first, over the second, and then weave back, and then you just go back and forth weaving over and under, doing the opposite of whatever you did in the previous row. So if you look at the thread where you're starting, if your weft, the one that the weaver that we're weaving with is called, we would call it the weft. If it's over that first thread that you come to, then when you go back, you go underneath it. whatever is the opposite. If you go back into the same place, you'll just end up unweaving. And again, I do not want to be pulling too tightly across the width of this. I want it to be quite loose so that my weaving doesn't get narrower. And again, as you can see, I'm fumbling around with that extra needle there. Again, that happens to me a lot, and perhaps if I practiced using pins I would get better at it, but every time one of them pokes me, I'm reminded why I don't want to do that. And there I'm loosening up again because every time things get tangled up, somehow it seems to get tightened up, so I'm loosening things so that that head shape stays fairly wide. I don't want it to get really pointy and narrow. And I'm using the needle there to push down the threads so that they're quite dense. Push down, but not pull tight from one side to the other. And that, if you've ever tried weaving, that's the same thing that you do when you're trying to weave fabric on a loom too. You push your threads down, but you want them to be loose from side to side. Otherwise your weaving gets narrower and narrower as you go. And now another thing that I realized is that this probably would have been a better idea if I had done something to keep those 4 threads spaced apart. So I didn't do anything to do that. And this is where my daughter called. And so I answered the call. Hello.
Hello.
So I'm gonna sew while you talk, and thought I could keep stitching, but realized that no, that was not going to happen. Unfortunately, while I was talking to her, I kept stitching, I just didn't keep recording. So what happened while I was talking to her? I finished off fumbling around with weaving the head back and forth. I've gone around and done a row of blanket stitches around the outside edge of my turtle, but then I decided that the turtle legs and head were too small, so I'm just going back in and making them bigger and more substantial just with some straight stitches like you see me doing here on the leg. So I've already done that on the head and the other leg, but I think that if you didn't want to try to do that complicated stitch, you could either cut the legs and the head out of a little bit of green fabric and just sew them on like we have with the lobster and the crab claws. I think if you did concentric rows of chain stitch, now I think that would actually be a lot easier. But in any case, that wasn't what I did, and here's the way my turtle looks in the end. I think it looks not bad. Happy stitching, and I hope you give a turtle a try. See you again soon. Bye for now.